Dialogue. So this is a One School for All lecture by Andrew Thomas for University Østfold, which I want you to watch by Monday the 16th of October. So we're going to continue with the idea of communication as a contrast to assessment. So we've been talking about assessment and testing, how to find out knowledge about students, and last week we talked about rudeness as listening to rudeness as kind of the opposite of testing, because it's a part of communication and a kind of political thing rather than treating the pupil as something that needs to be organised or managed. Whereas today we're going to talk about dialogue, which is much more of a kind of give and take thing rather than simply a listening strategy. But rather than it being a political aspect, I think we'd want to say that the dialogue that we're going to be looking at is more of an existential or a mystical phenomenon. It's something that, or at least the theory of dialogue that we're going to look at, treats our communication as something which is very much concerned with how I develop as a human being. So, the simple question that I want you to get used to asking in this technique is who are you talking to, and who is being spoken to? If I'm filling in a questionnaire, for example, who am I talking to? It's a question that I'm not talking to a piece of paper, but there is something that is addressing me, and I am giving an answer. So what's going on in that? Is what kind of conversation is that having? Is it the author of the questionnaire? Or in the testing situations that we've been looking at the beginning of the semester, tests and questionnaires are always administered by a particular person, and essentially the assumption in the entire Sattler book, for example, is that there are academically rigorous questionnaires and tests worked up, but they are administered by specially trained people, but they did not write the test. If they do administer the test, but then only administer bits of it or don't go through with the whole thing, it's just a funny structured conversation, and they're just using their own assessment. The individual who is administering the test is the expert. Whereas if you actually use the test rigorously from start to finish, then it is an empirically based rigorous test, like the one that we've been talking about, like with an analogy to medicine. But essentially, the question is, whose question is it? And I think the answer would be that it's not an authentic discussion. It's not a discussion that has a back and forth thing. It's a pre-prepared thing, and it only goes in one direction. Or, as Martin Buber, the person we're talking about today, would rather provocatively put it, people who respond to these questionnaires have become an it for the person who is administering the questionnaire, rather than a you. We're going to come back to what all that has to say, but first of all, I want to ask the question: who was Martin Buber? Because he's the guy that we're going to be talking about, and he's the person who wrote the book in your reading list. Martin Buber, an Austrian Jewish philosopher, writer, who was very influential at the beginning of the 1900s in the dialogue movement. I would say that he was probably like the best Erasmus student ever. He was born in Vienna in 1878, like I mentioned, but already at the age of 4, he moved to Lviv, Lemberg in Ukraine, to live with his grandparents because his parents split up. And then at the age of 14, moved to an area nearby, Bulovina. But then as a young man, he went to university back in Vienna again. But not just in Vienna. He soon went to university and studied in places like Leipzig and Zurich, and eventually settled in Berlin for a while. Whilst he was living in Berlin, he got married, he settled down a bit, and he dabbled in what we would call Zionism. Not the kind of Zionism that was interested in making a political state of Israel, or militarily. He was more interested in the kind of what we would associate with the kibbutz style of settlement, peaceful and dialogue-oriented, and more interested in. And he was a fan of the one-state solution, where two nations live in one state. He was also very interested, and he did his PhD thesis at this time in mystical philosophy, particularly some Renaissance thinkers, and the problem of individuation. The point is, he's very interested in spiritual thinking, individuation, how you and I experience the world, and that is what he is interested in and working on academically. He's also exploring his Jewish roots at this time, and he discovers Hasidism and thinks that that's a wonderful way of rejuvenating the dialogue and the discussion around Judaism. In 1916, he moves to Heppenheim Bergstrasse, and during this period, he continues to work academically, to lecture and to teach in these things and develop his thinking about Zionism. He in Frankfurt, where he does a lot of his work, he bumps into Franz Rosenzweig, and the two of them have an extremely fruitful academic discussion. Rosenzweig helps Buber's career so that he starts teaching. And particularly in an a Jewish adult education program, and at the university level. He stays in Frankfurt for quite some time, but in 1933 he's dismissed from his position, and is a bit of a loss as to how to continue working. And in 1937 he moves to Jerusalem, where he gets a position at the University of Jerusalem. Controversially, but then he spends the rest of his life in Jerusalem, and he becomes something of a celebrity, world celebrity. He travels the world, and because of his thought on dialogue, and because of the book I and Thou, which he wrote in 1924. So he becomes something of a celebrity, and he was extremely influential for the Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas, and indeed for a lot of dialogue thinking which has gone on in Norway. So that's Martin Buber. What is the thought behind all this? Well, the big idea is the question of, are you an object of the discussion, or are you a participant in the discussion? So maybe this cat is talking about me. Maybe he's talking trash about me and telling terrible things spreading terrible rumors about what I do in my spare time. But essentially, I am part of the cat's world at this point. I am what the cat is talking about. And so all the logical, the cat owes us to speak logically and to make sense about me, but not actually to speak to me. If, on the other hand, I'm actually here, then I'm actually taking part in this conversation with the cat. And that's two completely different roles. I'm a conversation partner, and the cat cannot actually speak about me without me also allowing me the possibility of speaking back, of talking back. We can talk to each other, and but essentially we're conversation partners rather than one being the object of the other's conversation. Now, and it really doesn't matter what we're talking about. We can talk about fish, or dogs, or lasagna, or the demise of humanity, or whatever it is, or whatever the cat might be planning. I can't be captured by that conversation because I'm always above. I'm also always outside this little speech bubble. I am not what we are talked about. The cat always has to use the word you, and the cat can essentially decide, is it going to take me seriously, or is it just going to stop the conversation? But it can't carry on the conversation without actually taking me seriously, because I am the person with whom the cat is having a conversation. So you see, there's essentially two completely different parts of roles. One is the object of conversation when I was down there, and the other is the you situation. And essentially that is true whenever we are talking with each other. You can either talk about people and objectify them and analyze them, or you can talk with people, and that means they are transcendent to what we are speaking about. They are not part of the field of logic. They are the conversation partner, by virtue of which there is a conversation at all, by virtue of which language can refer to other things at all, by virtue of which logic becomes useful in any way. So, two completely different relationships to discourse or thinking. The it relationship or the you relationship. And that's basically Buber's big idea. You can refer to people, you can talk about people, or you can talk to people, but those are two very different things. And you can always ask that question, is this an it or a you? So That's essentially, yes, this is all very philosophical and it seems quite simple, but it has enormous consequences for dialogue thought. It sounds also very grounded in modern philosophy, and it certainly is. There's very much a kind of Cartesian view of things in the world, whereas I am here over and above the world that is out there, which is probably not philosophically acceptable anymore. But the division between you and it certainly is acceptable, and it has some pretty practical consequences for noticing how you relate to other people when you're talking to somebody and when you are not.